I was summoned for what the calendar called a brief alignment. The room was sealed, quiet, and deliberate. At the head sat Calvin Reed, Chief Executive Officer, new suit, older confidence. To his right was Marjorie Lane, Director of Human Resources, binder open, pen already waiting. I was Lillian Moore, Senior Operations and Compliance Manager, 15 years into holding systems together that no one else bothered to understand. Calvin began without preface. "We don't reward divided loyalty," he said. "Applying elsewhere tells us everything we need to know." His voice stayed flat, practiced, as if trust were a line item he could delete. He said my employment was terminated, effective immediately. No warning, no discussion, authority performed, not earned. Marjorie pushed the termination agreement across the glass. "Sign here so we can close this efficiently," she said, careful to sound humane. The document reduced 15 years of operational control, audit defense, and compliance cleanup to a paragraph and a signature block. I noticed what it accused before I noticed what it omitted. I had managed louder crises than this. I asked one question, evenly, the way I always spoke when things mattered. "Can you confirm this termination followed the full internal separation protocol, including legal review?" Calvin frowned. "That won't be necessary," he replied. Marjorie didn't answer at all. The contrast was almost obscene. I had spent my career preventing shortcuts from becoming disasters. Calvin believed fear moved faster than process. He believed titles replaced understanding. He believed silence meant consent. "There's nothing to discuss," he added. "Security will handle access." Marjorie slid the pen closer, an invitation wrapped in pressure. I closed the folder without signing. "Then we're finished," I said, standing. No voices rose. No tears arrived. Their leverage depended on my compliance, and I refused to supply it. As I turned to leave, the absence finally crystallized. No general counsel, no compliance officer, no procedural witness. They had fired the person who enforced rules by breaking them themselves. In plain view, they didn't realize yet what that oversight would cost them. How are you feeling right now? Angry, quiet, or uncomfortably familiar with this? Have you ever been in a situation like mine? I truly hope you haven't. Where are you listening from at home, on the road, or during a rare moment just for yourself? If this story resonates with you, stay with me and consider subscribing, because this is only the beginning, and what comes next is where the silence finally breaks. I didn't always feel angry. For most of those 15 years, I felt useful, which is a quieter, more dangerous emotion. I stayed late to walk auditors through controls no one else could explain. I rewrote compliance workflows after executives broke them chasing speed. I patched reporting gaps before regulators noticed, and cleaned up crises so thoroughly they were later described as minor issues in board decks. Each fix made the company safer. Each fix made me easier to ignore. I asked for raises the responsible way. Not ultimatums, not theatrics, just numbers, metrics, documented results, every time. The answer came wrapped in patience. Next cycle, after the audit, once the market stabilizes. I believed them because believing felt professional. Year after year, my salary stayed frozen while expectations quietly expanded. Loyalty, I learned, was rewarded with more work. Then Calvin Reed arrived, introduced as transformation incarnate. He spoke about agility and decisive leadership, about cutting complacency. What he actually cut was memory. He dismissed legacy systems he didn't understand and replaced judgment with authority. His son, Ethan, followed soon after. Crowned a strategic advisor despite never carrying operational consequences, Ethan made fast decisions from clean spreadsheets, unaware they were connected to messy realities I had been containing for years. I watched real work collide with performative leadership. Processes I designed were bypassed to impress investors. Safeguards were labeled resistance. When problems surfaced, they landed on my desk anyway. I fixed them because failure still felt personal. Calvin took credit because visibility felt powerful. Ethan learned nothing because nothing ever touched him. The bitterness didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated in small humiliations. Seeing juniors I trained promoted past me, hearing my work summarized as support, being told I was invaluable, just not valuable enough to pay. I stopped asking for raises when I realized the delays were policy, not timing. What finally broke something open wasn't anger. It was clarity. As I mentally traced how reports flowed, how approvals stacked, how exceptions were resolved, I saw the pattern. Entire processes stabilized around me without acknowledgement. I wasn't part of the system. I was the brace holding it upright. That understanding didn't comfort me. It hardened me. I saw how easily my steadiness had been mistaken for submission. I saw how silence had trained them to assume permanence. 15 years without a raise wasn't oversight. It was extraction. The anger that followed was controlled, not loud. And it didn't ask for fairness anymore. It began asking different questions. What happens when the anchor steps aside? What fails first? And who, exactly, is standing in the blast radius? I didn't know the shape of the fallout yet, only that it would be slow, precise, and impossible to pretend away once it arrived fully. I walked out of the building without ceremony. No security escort, no forced smile from human resources, no final speech about gratitude. The badge in my hand still worked when I passed the turnstiles, which felt almost ironic. 15 years inside those systems had trained them to trust my movements even after they had decided to remove me. I stepped into the street, feeling oddly hollow, as if something essential had been shut down without triggering an alarm. The first few days were quiet, not peaceful, just empty. I slept later than usual and kept checking my phone out of habit, even though no alerts came in. Then, gradually, the silence broke. A former colleague mentioned a report that had gone out late. Another hinted that a compliance checklist had been submitted, with gaps no one noticed until after approval. These weren't disasters. They were paper cuts, small enough to dismiss, sharp enough to bleed. Inside the company, Calvin Reed moved quickly to control the narrative. In an all-hands meeting I wasn't invited to, he declared, "No one here is irreplaceable." The line traveled fast, repeated with admiration by people who needed to believe it. The message was clear. My absence would not slow anything down. The system, he insisted, was stronger without dependency on any single individual. I listened without reacting. Observation had always been part of my job. When processes fail, they don't collapse all at once, they hesitate. Deadlines slip by hours instead of days. Reviews come back with vague comments instead of approvals. People hesitate to make decisions they once made confidently. I recognized the signs because I had spent years preventing them. By the end of the week, the mistakes became slightly louder. A vendor invoice was flagged incorrectly. A regulatory update was misinterpreted and quietly ignored. Each issue was resolved eventually, but not cleanly. Corrections piled on top of corrections, adding friction to workflows that had once moved smoothly. No one connected these problems to me yet. They blamed workload. They blamed transition. I remained on the outside, watching without interference. That distance clarified things. From afar, the organization looked less like a machine and more like a series of habits held together by memory. My memory. I began to understand how much informal knowledge I had carried without documentation. How many decisions lived only in my head because writing them down had always seemed unnecessary. The call came late Friday afternoon. A mid-level operations manager I had trained years earlier hesitated before speaking. "I know you're not here anymore," he said. "But do you remember how we handled exception routing for the legacy accounts?" I closed my eyes briefly. Not from anger, but from recognition. That process had never been formalized. It had worked because I was there. I answered carefully, not with instructions, just with questions. "What does the policy say now?" I asked. He didn't know. We ended the call politely. When it was over, I sat still for a long time. The emptiness I'd felt walking out had shifted into something colder, more deliberate. They had declared me replaceable. The system was already asking where I'd gone. I realized then that my exit hadn't closed a chapter. It had removed a load-bearing wall. The structure still stood. For now. But it was already redistributing stress. Quietly. Unevenly. In ways that would only become visible with time ahead. Most people stop here, but the truth lies in the next part. I didn't rush to a lawyer. I waited until my thoughts felt orderly. Until anger stopped pretending it was strategy. Victor Shaw's office was quiet in a way that suggested precision, not comfort. He listened without interrupting while I described the conference room. The accusation of disloyalty. The paper slid across the table like a verdict already signed. When I finished, Victor didn't react the way people expect lawyers to react. He didn't promise retaliation or justice. He asked questions. Exact questions. Who was present? What titles they held? What language Calvin Reed used? Whether anyone mentioned legal review. Each answer narrowed something invisible. He started with procedure. Terminations at my level. Especially those implying misconduct. Required documented cause. Legal review. And a compliance witness. None of those were present. They skipped steps, he said calmly, as if noting a typo. Then he moved to language. The phrase lack of loyalty, spoken aloud, wasn't neutral. It implied wrongdoing without evidence. That matters, he said. Intent matters. We went through my employment agreement line by line. No non-compete clause, no broad confidentiality trap. The non-disclosure agreement was narrow, limited to specific data categories, most of which I hadn't accessed in months. I had been careful without realizing how important that care would become. Victor nodded. Once. You're clean, he said. Not innocent, clean. I expected relief. What I felt instead was clarity. The firing hadn't been decisive. It had been sloppy, authority, when rushed. Leaves fingerprints everywhere. Victor laid out the obvious path first. We could file a wrongful termination claim. We could demand damages, reputation repair, maybe even reinstatement. He explained it the way a mechanic explains replacing an engine. Straightforward, effective, loud. Then he shook his head. I wouldn't do that, he said. That stopped me. I had come prepared to fight. Why not, I asked. Because they don't think they did anything wrong, Victor replied. And people like that make better mistakes when they feel safe. Litigation, he explained, would force them into caution. They would lawyer up, slow down, sanitize records. The system would tighten defensively. The outcome might be fair, but the process would be controlled. What you have instead, he continued, is time and their overconfidence. He explained how organizations unravel when leadership dismisses process as inconvenience. How small compliance failures stack. How accusations spoken casually can turn into liability when repeated internally. You don't need to push, he said. You need to watch. The idea felt counterintuitive and oddly empowering. I wasn't being told to surrender. I was being advised to step aside and let gravity work. Victor summarized my position with unsettling calm. You were terminated improperly, accused loosely, and released without restraints. That's not weakness. That's an opening. When I left his office, I wasn't carrying legal papers or marching orders. I was carrying a framework. I understood where the company was exposed and where I was insulated. More importantly, I understood that restraint could be an action, not a delay. I didn't plan revenge that afternoon. I planned patience. I adjusted my expectations from immediate correction to eventual consequence. The law wasn't a weapon I needed to swing. It was a mirror. And sooner or later, they would walk past it again, careless, and recognize themselves too late. I knew from experience that organizations rarely collapse from one decision. They erode through repetition, through confidence reinforced by silence. Calvin and Marjorie believed authority ended conversations. That belief would invite more shortcuts, more careless statements, more undocumented choices. My role was no longer to correct them. It was to remain observant, reachable, and absent. Every unanswered question would widen a gap. Every rushed fix would harden into precedent. I wasn't waiting for justice. I was letting structure test itself without its stabilizer. Exactly as designed. What followed would not be dramatic, but it would be irreversible once momentum replaced denial entirely fully. By the third month, the company's problems had acquired a rhythm, not chaos, not crisis, just a steady pattern of friction that never quite resolved itself. From the outside, it looked manageable, from experience. I knew it was not. Systems don't fail loudly when the wrong people are in charge. They fail politely, in increments small enough to dismiss until they form a record. I kept my distance deliberately. I didn't call anyone. I didn't offer help. I documented what surfaced through former colleagues, vendors, and industry chatter. A reporting cycle closed late by half a day. A compliance checklist referenced an outdated guideline. A routine filing included language that had been revised years earlier. Back when I still had the authority to enforce updates. Each issue was corrected eventually, but each correction left residue. An extra email, an internal explanation, a justification logged somewhere it didn't belong. Inside the company, Daniel Price, the chief financial officer, noticed. He had always understood numbers better than people, which made him cautious in the right ways. According to someone who sat 2 offices down from him, Daniel flagged the delays during a leadership review. He framed them carefully, using neutral language, emphasizing risk exposure rather than blame. Calvin Reed dismissed the concerns with practiced confidence. "We're in a transition phase," he said. "Noise is expected." Daniel pushed once more. Calvin shut it down. That interaction mattered more than any single error. When finance warns operations and leadership ignores it, the signal isn't weakness, it's permission. After that meeting, decisions sped up in the wrong places. Shortcuts became normalized. Documentation thinned. People stopped escalating questions because escalation no longer led to clarity, only irritation. I observed all of it without stepping in. Patience, I had learned, was not the absence of action. It was the discipline of timing. Every instinct I had told me to correct the mistakes before they compounded. That instinct was exactly what had kept the company stable for 15 years. It was also what had made me invisible. I resisted it. By the end of the third month, the failures became just noticeable enough to attract attention beyond internal walls. Nothing dramatic, no headlines, just a quiet inquiry from an industry body requesting a routine compliance review. Those reviews were normal. I had coordinated dozens of them. When handled properly, they were paperwork exercises that closed cleanly. When mishandled, they became magnifying glasses. The request landed on Calvin's desk the same way everything else did, as an inconvenience. He reassured the executive team that it was standard procedure and delegated preparation to a newly promoted manager unfamiliar with historical exceptions. That choice alone guaranteed delays. Context matters in compliance, and context had been treated as expendable. I wrote the inquiry down in my notes and did nothing else. I didn't celebrate. I didn't speculate. I understood what this meant in structural terms. An external review freezes assumptions. It forces documentation where memory once sufficed. It exposes who knows how things actually work and who only knows how they should work. Daniel Price, according to the same source, requested additional resources to prepare. Calvin declined. "We'll handle it internally," he said. Control, once mistaken for leadership, rarely loosens its grip voluntarily. As the month closed, I felt neither satisfaction nor vindication. I felt steadiness. The system was testing itself without its stabilizer, and the results were consistent with every model I had ever built. Small failures don't resolve themselves. They accumulate evidence. And evidence, unlike loyalty, doesn't care who holds the title when it finally has to speak. I remained patient because patience preserved options. Nothing I observed required intervention yet. Only awareness. The structure was still standing, still functional, but strain was migrating to places leadership never inspected. When accountability is delayed, it doesn't disappear, it settles. I was not steering events. I was allowing them to proceed exactly as designed. Under assumptions, Calvin trusted far too much. Those assumptions would soon encounter scrutiny they could not manage fully. Calvin's confidence grew louder as the cracks stayed quiet. From what I was told, he began speaking openly about shedding outdated practices, using my absence as proof that the company had outgrown caution. In meetings, he framed the past as drag. "We don't need legacy thinking slowing us down," he said, according to someone who still sat in the room. The irony was sharp. Those so-called legacy practices were the very controls that had kept regulators satisfied and clients calm for years. Ethan Reed amplified the message with enthusiasm only inexperience can sustain. As his father's strategic advisor, he pushed a new framework that promised speed and visibility. Departments were reorganized without consultation. Approval layers were flattened without understanding why they existed. Ethan spoke in clean diagrams and confident forecasts, unaware that each box he removed carried informal safeguards built through repetition and consequence. Operations resisted quietly. Compliance objected carefully. Finance hesitated. The tension never reached open conflict, but it never resolved either. From the outside, the situation felt strangely theatrical. Calvin and Ethan performed certainty while everyone else adapted defensively. I recognized the pattern because I had mediated it before. When leadership declares transformation without mapping dependencies, the burden shifts downward. People stop trusting the system and start protecting themselves. Decisions slow, not because of process, but because of fear. It was during this phase that a former client reached out. Elaine Porter, a senior partner at a firm I had worked with closely for years, called under the pretense of catching up. We spoke carefully. She mentioned recent delays and inconsistent responses from my old company. Then she asked, almost casually, "Is there something we should know?" The question wasn't about gossip. It was about risk. I listened more than I spoke. I confirmed nothing. I corrected nothing. Elaine knew better than to ask directly for advice that could cross a line. She framed her concern around continuity. "We're evaluating our exposure," she said, "and we value perspective." That word lingered. Perspective. It would have been easy to step in, to explain how things used to work, to point out exactly where the new strategy was unraveling. That instinct surfaced immediately, familiar and tempting. It was the instinct that had made me reliable. It was also the instinct I no longer trusted. I declined to consult. "I can't get involved directly," I said, and meant it. Then I paused and added one sentence. Measured and precise. "If you're reviewing exposure, I'd look closely at how exception handling has changed. Nothing more. No names, no accusations. Just a suggestion framed as curiosity." Elaine understood. She thanked me and ended the call without pressing further. When the line went dead, I felt the tension settle deeper, not sharper. The situation didn't require intervention. It required contrast. Calvin's public dismissal of the past was building expectations he couldn't meet. Ethan's strategy was accelerating decisions without absorbing responsibility. Partners like Elaine were beginning to notice the difference between speed and stability. I observed how false confidence feeds on applause and ignores hesitation. Internally, the company celebrated boldness. Externally, trust thinned. Those two trajectories rarely intersect peacefully. I didn't need to influence outcomes. I needed to remain consistent, predictable, unavailable. My refusal to engage directly preserved credibility in ways participation never could. As weeks passed, the tension became ambient, not panic, not outrage, just a collective awareness that something essential had shifted. Calvin mistook silence for agreement. Ethan mistook charts for alignment. I recognized both errors and let them stand. The system was adjusting to leadership that believed confidence could replace comprehension. I didn't feel victorious. I felt amused in a restrained, professional way. Watching certainty outrun structure is always unsettling, even when it's expected. The irony was complete. They had dismissed the old ways without realizing those ways were still holding the floor beneath them. All I had done was step aside and allow the imbalance to register naturally, in real time. Across every decision they rushed forward next. The next part may change the way you view the whole story. By the 6th month, the air around the company had changed. It wasn't panic yet, but pressure has a way of announcing itself before anyone names it. The warning arrived quietly, exactly the way serious problems prefer to enter. It came as a formal letter from the industry oversight body, requesting clarification on several routine filings. They called it a standard compliance inquiry. Inside the company, the letter triggered movement without direction. Meetings multiplied. Email threads lengthened without resolution. People spoke in careful phrases, avoiding conclusions. Calvin Reed treated the warning as an inconvenience, not a signal. "This is normal," he told his leadership team. "We've handled these before." He delegated preparation to human resources and moved on. Marjorie Lane responded differently. She called an internal meeting and framed the task as cleanup. "We need to simplify our records," she said. "Remove outdated files so we don't confuse reviewers." Her tone was efficient, almost reassuring. I heard about the instruction from 2 different sources within 24 hours. Marjorie had directed teams to delete older documentation that no longer felt relevant. Exception logs, archived emails, internal notes explaining why certain steps existed. She called it streamlining. She called it housekeeping. What she didn't call it was destruction of mandatory records. I knew immediately what that meant. Retention rules in our industry were explicit. Certain documents had to be preserved for fixed periods, regardless of leadership preference. Deleting them wasn't efficiency, it was a violation. I didn't warn anyone. I didn't send emails or make calls. That instinct still existed, but it was no longer mine to act on. Control now meant restraint. Pressure intensified quietly over the next weeks. Teams hesitated, unsure what was safe to keep. Some deleted too much. Others froze, afraid to touch anything. The inconsistency itself became a risk. Daniel Price noticed. As chief financial officer, he understood exposure when he saw it. According to someone close to him, he confronted Calvin directly. "We can't erase history," Daniel said. "This puts us at risk." Calvin dismissed him. "We're cleaning house," Calvin replied. "Don't overthink it." That exchange sealed the direction of events. Once record deletion becomes policy, intent stops mattering. All that remains is evidence of action. I noted the date, the directive, and the people involved. I kept no copies, requested no documents. My role was observation, not preservation. When organizations feel watched, they either tighten discipline or panic. Calvin chose speed. Marjorie chose erasure. Both choices increased pressure instead of releasing it. By the end of the 6th month, the warning letter had done its work. It hadn't punished anyone. It had revealed behavior under scrutiny. I felt the pressure too, but it was controlled. Escalation had begun, and it was no longer theoretical. I understood now why Victor had urged patience. Warnings create reactions. Reactions create records. Records don't lie, even when people do. Every deletion, every dismissal, every careless quote added weight. I stayed unreachable by design, not hidden, not evasive, just absent. If anyone needed guidance, policy was available. If they wanted certainty, they would have to earn it internally. The pressure they felt was the pressure of unsupported decisions. Looking back, this was the moment momentum locked in. Compliance doesn't collapse. It accumulates consequences. The warning letter was only the first formal signal. Everything after would build on how they responded here. I felt no urge to celebrate. Escalation is not victory, it is commitment. I had committed to observation, accuracy, and time. The pressure would keep rising, whether they noticed or not, inside the company. Deletion continued under the banner of efficiency. Outside, oversight moved at its own pace. Those timelines would eventually meet. I didn't need to accelerate anything, I only needed to stay precise. The pressure was no longer hypothetical. It had shape and direction. People inside the organization felt it in meetings and silences. They just didn't yet understand its source. I did, and that understanding came with responsibility. Not to intervene, not to warn, not to rescue. Rescue would erase the record forming in real time. Pressure, once released too early, loses its evidentiary value. So I waited, steady and deliberate. The warning had landed. The response had been reckless. Everything else would follow logically from that point forward. Pressure does not need permission to grow. It only needs neglect. They were supplying that in abundance. And I was done correcting it. Month 6 closed with everything in motion. The warning stood unanswered in substance. The pressure had nowhere to go but inward. And that was exactly where real failures begin. Quietly, predictably, without witnesses. The counterattack didn't come with lawyers first. It came with whispers. By the time I heard about it, Calvin Reed had already decided on a story that positioned him as the defender and me as the threat. In internal meetings, he framed recent instability as external interference. She's influencing partners, he said. According to someone still in the room, we're dealing with coordinated pressure, saying my name wasn't necessary. The implication did the work. That narrative served two purposes. It excused internal failures and justified defensive behavior. Once blame points outward, accountability retreats inward. I recognized the tactic immediately. It was crude, but effective with people who needed reassurance. The company didn't have problems. It had an enemy. The first direct consequence landed fast. A major client paused contract renewals, citing concerns about continuity and compliance posture. Officially, it was a temporary measure. Internally, it was treated as confirmation that something hostile was happening beyond their control. Calvin escalated the rhetoric. "We're being undermined," he said. "This is retaliation. I had done nothing. No calls, no guidance, no commentary. Silence. However, rarely survives fear. When people need a target, absence becomes suspicious. Victor Shaw handled the response before I even asked. He sent a formal letter to the company's legal department demanding an immediate halt to defamatory statements. The language was restrained but unambiguous. Allegations of interference, spoken without evidence, constituted reputational harm. Cease and desist. The letter concluded. Simple. Direct. Calvin didn't back down. He doubled down. In another meeting, he told his team, "If she thinks hiding behind a lawyer will scare us, she's wrong." That sentence circulated quickly. It was repeated with bravado, not caution. It told me exactly how exposed they felt. I stayed defensive by remaining still. Every instinct trained over 15 years urged me to clarify, to correct, to explain. I suppressed it. Defense, in this phase, meant containment. The more they spoke, the more they documented intent. The louder the accusation, the clearer the record. Then the call came. Not from the company. From the client. Elaine Porter didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We've paused our agreement," she said. "Not because of you, because we don't trust what we're hearing." She explained that Calvin's team had suggested I was actively influencing partners. Elaine's voice tightened. "I wanted to hear from you directly." I told her the truth. Narrowly. "I haven't contacted anyone," I said. "I haven't offered guidance or opinions. I didn't elaborate. I didn't defend myself." Elaine listened carefully. Then she asked the question that shifted everything. "If we wanted independent clarity," she said, "would you be open to talking?" The room went quiet on my end. That invitation mattered. It wasn't about loyalty or revenge. It was about credibility. "I can't advise on your relationship with them," I replied, "but I can explain how certain processes are supposed to function, in general terms." There was a pause. Then relief. "That's all we need," Elaine said. We scheduled nothing. We agreed on no scope. The call ended without commitment. That restraint protected both of us. Still, the implication traveled faster than any agreement. The client had bypassed the narrative and gone straight to the source. Inside the company, panic sharpened. The paused contract became leverage in Calvin's hands. "This proves interference," he insisted. Legal pushed back quietly. Finance grew tense. Human resources circled, unsure which version to preserve. Victor sent a second letter. Firmer this time. It cited specific statements attributed to Calvin and demanded correction. Silence followed. Not compliance. Silence. I understood the dynamic clearly now. This was no longer about defense alone. It was about posture. Calvin believed escalation would restore control. I knew escalation only increased exposure. The client's outreach wasn't collaboration, it was triangulation. I felt the tension settle into something colder. The counterattack had failed to isolate me. Instead, it had pulled me into clearer focus. I hadn't moved. I hadn't pushed. I had simply remained reachable. That was enough. As the week closed, the company tightened internally, convinced it was under siege. Outside, trust quietly rerouted. I didn't celebrate. I prepared. Defense had shifted into positioning, and the next move wouldn't belong to Calvin at all. The hearing began without drama, which made it worse. Compliance reviews are designed to feel procedural, almost boring, because boredom lowers defenses. I sat in the back of the room, not as a participant, but as an observer with standing. My presence noted and then deliberately ignored. Calvin Reed arrived confident, flanked by counsel, posture rigid with certainty. He spoke first. Our internal disruptions were the result of outside influence, he said. We acted responsibly at every stage. His voice carried the practiced calm of someone used to controlling rooms. For a moment, it worked. Then the data started speaking. The review panel walked through timelines, document trails, and internal directives. Dates were read aloud. Decisions were mapped against policy. Calvin nodded along until the first inconsistency surfaced. A retention log showed deletions authorized after the warning letter. Calvin shook his head. That's incorrect, he said quickly. Those actions predated oversight. The chair didn't argue. She displayed another record, same directive, different timestamp. Silence spread. I felt my pulse rise. Contained. Deliberate. This was the danger zone where stories fracture. Questions followed, precise and narrow. Who authorized deletions? Who approved revised procedures? Who overrode finance objections? Calvin answered confidently until confidence required memory. When he hesitated, the room noticed. Daniel Price was called next. As chief financial officer, he had avoided eye contact with Calvin all morning. When he spoke, his tone was careful, almost regretful. I raised concerns, Daniel said. I documented them. He glanced at the panel. Not at Calvin. I was instructed to proceed anyway. Calvin turned toward him. That's not accurate, he said sharply. Daniel didn't react. He handed over emails. Dates matched the earlier timeline. Warnings, responses, dismissals. The room shifted. This was no longer abstract risk. It was traceable decision-making. I stayed still, hands folded, breathing measured. This wasn't vindication. It was exposure. The panel asked Daniel one final question. If you believed the actions were non-compliant, why didn't you escalate further? Daniel answered without drama. Because escalation had become unwelcome. That sentence landed harder than any accusation. Calvin spoke again. Louder now. We were under pressure, he said. We had to move fast. The chair interrupted him. Speed does not suspend responsibility, she replied. The words were calm. Final. As the session closed, the panel summarized preliminary findings, procedural violations, inconsistent testimony, governance failures. Then came the line that changed everything. We will be evaluating individual accountability at the executive level. The room froze. Calvin stiffened. Counsel leaned in too late. That sentence separated the company from the person leading it. I felt the tension compress, sharp and contained. Walking out. No one spoke to me. They didn't need to. The hearing hadn't resolved anything yet, but it had shifted the center of gravity. Responsibility had a name now, and it wasn't abstract. I stepped into the hallway, feeling the pressure finally exhale. Just slightly. 12 months of restraint had led here. Not to triumph, not to relief, but to inevitability. The process was no longer theoretical. It was documented, recorded, and moving forward without regard for confidence or control. Behind me, doors closed softly. Ahead, consequences aligned themselves with the truth, one procedural step at a time. That awareness tightened my focus rather than easing it. Hearings like this do not end stories, they authorize the next phase. I understood that Calvin would leave, convinced he could still control the outcome. That counsel would advise containment, that internal messaging would soften language. None of that altered the record created today. Records persist. They travel. They invite follow-up. I felt the suspense settle not as fear, but as compression, like a spring locked in place. The process had momentum now, independent of personalities. Whatever came next would not require my voice or my intervention. It would require only consistency. I walked away, knowing the most dangerous moment had passed. Not because the truth had prevailed, but because it had been acknowledged aloud. In a room that measured words for a living, I sensed the room would echo this moment later. When consequences no longer felt procedural, and certainty finally gave way to accountability, no title could outrun without warning or mercy. The collapse didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It unfolded through notifications, pauses, and decisions quietly reversed. I learned about the first contract cancellation from a former colleague who texted a single line, they pulled it. That contract had been the company's anchor, the one Calvin Reed referenced whenever confidence wavered. Its suspension changed the tone of everything that followed. Officially, the client cited governance concerns. Internally, the reason was clearer. The hearing had created a record no amount of messaging could soften. Once trust is interrupted, it doesn't resume on assurances. It demands evidence. The board understood that quickly. Emergency meetings replaced strategy sessions. Risk officers began speaking with authority they hadn't used in months. Calvin was suspended before the week ended. The announcement was brief, neutral, almost polite. Pending further review, it said. No defense, no praise. I imagined him reading it, realizing how suddenly titles can evaporate when protection withdraws. For all his certainty, he had never planned for isolation. Marjorie Lane didn't receive an announcement. She received a calendar invite, internal investigation, mandatory participation. The same administrative tone she had used on others now enclosed her. I felt no satisfaction in that symmetry, only a steady sense of correction. Processes she had bypassed were now pointed directly at her decisions. What struck me most was how quickly language changed. Words like transformation and efficiency disappeared. They were replaced by containment and remediation. The organization didn't collapse emotionally. It recalibrated. Responsibility flowed toward the source. Ethan Reed vanished without ceremony. No farewell note, no strategic update. His title was removed quietly from internal directories. Someone said he stepped back to focus on personal priorities. The silence around his exit spoke louder than any announcement. Influence evaporates fastest when it was never earned. As these shifts unfolded, I felt the pressure release gradually, like a held breath exhaled in increments. This wasn't revenge. It was resolution. The system wasn't punishing individuals. It was correcting imbalance. I remained distant, but not disconnected. The board reached out through counsel to confirm procedural details. I answered factually, briefly. Nothing I said accelerated outcomes. It didn't need to. Momentum belonged to the record now, not to me. When the final notice arrived, confirming the contract termination, I closed my laptop and sat quietly. 15 years of accumulation had resolved into consequence without spectacle. Justice, I realized, doesn't require anger to function. It requires structure. The days that followed were strangely calm. There were no victory calls, no apologies, no sudden acknowledgments of my role. That absence felt appropriate. Recognition, delayed too long, often arrives misshapen. I didn't need it anymore. Instead, I watched the organization stabilize around new constraints. Policies were rewritten with care. Approval paths lengthened where they had been recklessly shortened. Questions that once irritated leadership were now encouraged. Caution returned, not as fear, but as respect for consequence. I noticed something else too. People who had stayed silent began speaking again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with precision. They referenced policy. They asked for documentation. They slowed decisions that felt rushed. Culture doesn't change through slogans. It changes when behavior is finally allowed to align with reality. I understood then that collapse is a misleading word. What had happened wasn't destruction. It was correction at scale. The structure had bent too far in one direction, and now it was rebalancing. As I stepped fully away, I felt a clean sense of closure. The story no longer belonged to me. It belonged to the record, the process, and the consequences that followed naturally. That, more than any apology or settlement, felt like justice. I carried that understanding forward without bitterness. The collapse had answered every question I once asked quietly in hallways and meetings. It confirmed that patience can be an action, and restraint can shape outcomes more reliably than force. I didn't win anything tangible that day. I regained something harder to quantify: trust in the system's ability to correct itself when pressure is applied at the right point, with accuracy and without compromise. It reminded me that justice rarely arrives loudly, but when it does arrive correctly, it leaves no room for denial or revision later. At all. I received the call on a quiet morning, the kind that invites reflection rather than urgency. The new board didn't speak in absolutes. They spoke in corrections. They acknowledged missteps, referenced risk mitigation, and thanked me for my previous service. Then came the offer. They wanted me back, not quietly, not temporarily, but formally, with a salary 3 times what I had earned when I left. I listened without reacting. They framed the offer as restoration, as if time could be reversed by numbers. They spoke about stability, continuity, and trust. I let them finish. Calm has weight when you don't rush to fill silence. When I responded, I didn't negotiate money. I outlined conditions. Ethical guardrails written into authority. Compliance independence protected from executive override. Direct reporting lines that could not be softened by convenience. I asked for decision power equal to responsibility, and transparency enforced rather than encouraged. These were not demands. They were requirements. The room shifted. I could hear it, even through a speakerphone. One board member cleared his throat. Another asked if I was open to compromise. I said no. I won't return to a structure that mistakes obedience for alignment. I told them. My voice stayed even. This wasn't leverage. It was clarity. They tried again, reframing my conditions as aspirational. We need flexibility, someone said. I replied. Flexibility is what broke governance last time. No one argued that point. Silence followed. Heavier now. I understood their position. Boards don't like constraints that limit their discretion, even when those constraints prevent failure. What I was asking for would have changed the organization's power geometry. It would have removed plausible deniability. They weren't ready for that. Not yet. The chair finally spoke. We can't commit to all of this immediately. That was the answer. I thanked them for their honesty. I declined the offer. Ending the call felt oddly gentle. There was no triumph, no bitterness, just confirmation. Winning doesn't always look like acceptance. Sometimes it looks like refusal made without resentment. Afterward, I sat quietly and considered what had shifted. I hadn't forced accountability. I had defined it. They couldn't meet it. And that limitation belonged to them, not me. The offer itself was proof of outcome. They didn't call because they valued me emotionally. They called because systems remember who stabilizes them. Compensation is often the language of late recognition. I didn't need their title or their approval anymore. My leverage wasn't scarcity. It was coherence. I had learned where I stood, and more importantly, where I wouldn't stand again. Walking away a second time felt different. The first departure had been imposed. This one was chosen. Quietly, decisively, and without regret. I stepped forward into work shaped by my terms, not theirs. That decision marked the end of negotiation and the beginning of authorship. I no longer reacted to systems designed by others. I designed my own parameters, clients, and obligations. Freedom didn't arrive as celebration, but as alignment between principle and practice. The board had offered correction without transformation. I chose transformation without permission. In that choice, the victory stayed quiet, internal, and durable, because it required no witness, no approval, and no future apology. It sealed my authority permanently, independent of institutions that once mistook endurance for consent alone today. I learned about Calvin Reed's exit the same way I learned most truths by then, quietly, without commentary. An industry notice confirmed he had chosen to pursue opportunities outside the sector. No farewell tour, no advisory role, just absence. Power leaves the way it arrives when it was never anchored to substance. The company followed a different path. Restructuring wasn't cosmetic. Reporting lines were redrawn. Oversight committees gained authority instead of slogans. Policies once treated as optional were rewritten into obligations. People stopped improvising and started documenting. It wasn't redemption, it was repair. I watched from a distance, no longer invested in outcomes. My work had moved elsewhere. I built an independent practice focused on governance, operational risk, and crisis prevention. Clients didn't come looking for drama. They came looking for stability. Experience translated cleanly when it was no longer buried under politics. For the first time in years, effort and authority matched. What surprised me most was the absence of anger. I had imagined closure might feel like vindication. Instead, it felt like space. Time had done what confrontation never could. It separated behavior from excuses. It allowed systems to reveal their preferences without my interference. Discipline replaced emotion, and discipline proved more durable. People occasionally asked if I felt satisfied. The question always missed the point. Satisfaction implies victory over someone else. What I felt was alignment. I hadn't punished anyone. I had stepped aside and let structure enforce its own rules. That distinction mattered. 18 months changed perspective. I no longer replayed conversations or rehearsed arguments. The narrative had resolved itself through consequence. Calvin left the industry he once dominated. The organization he led recalibrated under constraints it previously ignored. I continued forward, unburdened by unfinished business, looking back. The lesson was uncomplicated. Revenge fueled by anger burns fast and leaves residue. Resolution built on time, discipline, and systems leaves nothing to clean up. I didn't win by shouting or striking back. I won by refusing to stabilize what refused to respect balance. That refusal created room for something better. Work that reflected my values, boundaries that held, authority that didn't require fear. The story closed without spectacle, exactly as it should have. Justice doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply arrives, complete and quiet, when patience has done its work. I moved on carrying certainty, not bitterness, and trusted systems to remember everything eventually in time. If you're still here listening to this story, ask yourself honestly, have you ever stayed too long, hoping effort would be noticed? Are you staying to the end right now because something in this feels familiar? I'm curious, where are you listening from today? Your city, your country, your quiet corner of the world? Share it in the comments. And if this story made you feel seen, please like it, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe. Not for numbers, but because stories like this remind us we're not alone.